Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Hello and welcome to a new episode in our debut Spotlight series, where we shine the light on the freshest authors and their work. Today, I'm excited to be discussing the beautiful new novel Placeholders, which is out tomorrow and published by Verve Books. Placeholders is a truly incredible story, one that will resonate with so many people. It's a novel about identity, love, grief, and so much more, described as perfect for fans of Sally Rooney, Coco Mellors, and David Nichols. It is as devastating as it is heartwarming. The author of Placeholders is James Roseman. James is an American Jewish writer who was raised outside of Boston and now lives in Dublin. He received his MFA in Creative Writing and Literature from the Bennington Writing Seminars at Bennington College, Vermont. He is the recipient of an Agility Award from the Arts Council of Ireland and was shortlisted for the Bridport Short Story Prize. Here to chat all about his debut novel, welcome James to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to start us off, my favourite question, as you know, is to ask what you're currently reading, and I believe you've come prepared for this.
I have. Big fan of the show, so I knew what to expect.
Thank you.
I'm currently working on a writing project, and what I've found for myself is that I tend to try to read things that I'm trying to emulate in what I'm writing. So I'm currently reading two books. One of them is Jesus' Son, which is a collection of stories by Dennis Johnson. And I'm just so in love with the kind of style of writing that he achieves and how much he manages to say in so few sentences. And the second is because my wife and I are huge Halloween people. And so I started reading The Haunting of Hill House by
Nice.
Shirley Jackson again while we're like rewatching the TV show as well.
Oh,
So
I
there's my
love that. Why are you big Halloween fans?
For me, the town that I grew up in is not far away from Salem, which is like
Makes
big
sense.
Salem witch trials and everything. So it's always been kind of a big part of childhood and just kind of stuck around.
I love that. Would you say that's a time of year that you miss home?
I think so. Yeah, I think New England in the fall is particularly nice because you
Yeah,
get like the leaves changing and you get I think there's sort of memories of childhood activities like going to apple picking and this kind of stuff.
nice.
Yeah.
I feel like America does Halloween really well, so
Yeah, I agree.
I would love to go out there just for that.
Yeah, definitely
And
recommend.
I think Jesus' Son is a great recommendation. I feel like I remember it being really dark though.
It is extremely dark.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, yeah, yeah. Just as a slight warning, it's like a
Yeah,
book to
it's
throw
really
away.
good though. The writing style is incredible. So I think
Yeah.
for any writers, it's a great recommendation. Being able to do so much in such a small amount of words is always an incredible talent. But yeah, it's a really great collection. So I love those recommendations. Thank you. We are a week away from publication. How are you feeling? I should say
Feeling,
publication of your novel.
yeah, yeah. No, our publication, yeah. It feels strange. Writing books is so weird because it happens very quickly and then it happens
Mhm,
very slowly. I finished writing this book, over a year and a half ago, and to finally be able to share it with people is really exciting, and it's also
mhm.
kind of nerve-wracking because it's no longer mine in a way. Once it gets published, it doesn't belong to me anymore. It's whatever people make of it. And mostly I'm just excited to see what people make of it.
Yeah, I am excited to chat to people about this, and I do try and keep these episodes spoiler free. So, for listeners, there will be no spoilers in this episode, but I am very excited to chat to more people about this book because I think, as I just said then, it's such a talent to be able to do so much in such a short space of time with this is like a 250-page book and you connect to these characters so much you don't want to leave them, and I messaged you and said I was completely obsessed, and I was so devastated by the end of the book that I just kind of put it down and I was like, I just need a minute. I didn't want to leave them. They're so great.
Uh,
But before we delve into the book, I want to talk about your journey as a writer. What would you say the experience of getting your debut out into the world has been like?
Yeah, it was I had what I understand to be a very abnormal experience. I was at a literary magazine launch. I was probably like three chapters into this or like working on the first draft of it. And I met somebody who is also a writer and he said he was also working on a novel. He said, "Why don't we swap pages?" And so we did. And then he emailed me a few weeks later, and he said, "I didn't tell you this, but actually, I'm a scout for a literary agency." And I've really enjoyed your pages, so I passed them up. And that's actually how I wound up meeting and signing with my agent. And it was
That's
right around the time of,
incredible.
yes, like totally serendipitous. And then a few weeks later was London Book Fair. And by the end of the week, I got an email that Verve was interested. So
Oh my
it all
gosh,
happened
I love
very,
this
very quickly.
story.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And yeah, you're right. Like it's not, it's not a traditional thing for debut authors. Some really struggle, but I'm really happy for you that this has happened. I think it's amazing. And it's not just a case of luck, which, you have got very lucky with this, but you do have immense talent. So I think it's very much deserved, and I'm glad that it's found a home with Verve because it's such a wonderful novel. And I was wondering if you could describe placeholders to the listeners.
Yeah, of course, of course. So, Placeholders is a book about a relationship between an American Jewish man named Aaron and an Irish woman named Roisin. And the book is set in Boston. And I think while it's about their relationship, it's also very much so about them and the things that they have in common and the things that differentiate them. A big theme throughout the book is homesickness and displacement. So for Aaron, this is estrangement from his parents. He hasn't spoken to his parents in 5 years since his brother died. And for Roisin, this is geographic. She has not been home to Ireland since she moved to Boston, and it's been several years.
Amazing. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough to the listeners how much I love this book. And as I mentioned in my intro, you've been compared to quite a few major authors in the sort of contemporary literary fiction sphere. And I feel like with your book, I like to Normal People by Sally Rooney, Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Mellors, and One Day by David Nichols. Your novel feels like those books that it could be a love story, but the relationship between the two people is less about romance and more about figuring out their identities and finding connection in another person, and how this sort of special connection that they find and the special bond that they find sort of helps them find themselves through that. What was your experience like of creating Roisin and Aaron's relationship, and did you ever kind of feel tempted to give them this happily ever after?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. I think for me, I moved to Dublin like 5.5, 6 years ago. Before that, I pretty much spent my whole life around the Boston area from, 8 years old. And being away from home for the first time in like a really concrete way,
Hmm.
there's this level of homesickness that's kind of layered.
Hmm.
And what I wanted to do was try to peel apart these layers and kind of separate them into two characters. And for me, I think of it as geographic displacement, as in the kind of homesickness of physically being thousands of miles away from your home
Hmm.
and knowing that you can't just, get in a car or just walk over and see people that you've known your whole life. But the other side of it is this kind of knowledge that life at home is moving on without you. And I really believe that there's this thing when you move countries where maybe I had this naive belief that you'd move and then you'd have two homes kind of straight away. And what happens instead is that the old life kind of starts to move on without you before
Hmm.
you've necessarily created a new one to take its place. And so I was thinking a lot about that, and I wanted to put it into these two characters. And yeah, the it kind of went from there, I think. This book really started as a short story that I was working on during my MFA, and I was pretty dead set on only writing short stories through the program. And then at the end of it, my final mentor, this author named Alice Madison, she said, the scene is kind of dead middle in the book. And she said, this short story, like it works as a story. I'm not saying that you've done a bad job or anything, but I'm so curious about everything that precedes and kind of
Mm.
follows this that you should really consider trying to take a stab at this. So all these things were kind of floating around my head and then give it a shot.
I mean, thank goodness that she said that because I wouldn't be holding this in my hand today. Yeah, I'm really glad that you chose to expand this into a novel because I already felt after like 250 pages it was unbearable to leave them. So I don't know how I'd cope if it was a short story. This is just completely selfish as a reader. I'm like, Thank you. I feel like you did that just for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
But you did mention there about homesickness and about your own experiences, and it is such a personal thing, of course. And I found it really moving, especially there's a kind of moment in the book where it's Christmas and Roisin is kind of calling home in Ireland, and she just feels so far removed from her family and from everything that they're experiencing, and she's kind of on the phone to them while they're in the middle of like making cups of tea for the rest of the family, and she just feels like, I don't know, I think it just makes her feel incredibly lonely. In your own experience, would you say it was moments like that that made you feel homesick, the special occasions and things like that, or would it just kind of creep up on you out the blue?
Yeah, no, I think it was mostly special occasions,
Yeah.
things you have memories of doing at home, or
Hmm.
you have this kind of deep-seated connection between place and event. So for me, there's certain, holidays that I would have been with family or
Yeah.
things like that. I think there is, I mean, present in the book and also obviously in my life, there's sort of this part of that identity element is the Jewish identity element. And it was
Yes.
certainly a change for me to go from growing up in such a Jewish community surrounded by kind of friends and family and this shared experience to moving to a country with substantially, fewer, certainly a smaller demographic,
Yeah.
to put it lightly. And so I think there's things around events and also experiences that where before you went through with family and friends, you now go through alone. And I wanted to make sure that that was present in the book, both in terms of the kind of Jewish identity side, which really comes out in
Hmm.
Aaron's story and Aaron's perspective, but also just this sense of, being alone during a time when you would have been with family or would have been with friends.
And you've just mentioned there that, alike to one of your protagonists, Aaron, Aaron is of course Jewish, and you yourself are, and your novel kind of tackles these struggles with cultural identity. And I was curious what it was like to write about such a personal part of your identity.
Yeah, it was difficult.
Yeah, yeah,
I think what makes it difficult to write about things like this is it's hard not to feel like you're going to be held up as a representative of a greater
yeah.
kind of group. And it was an important thing to remind myself that I was conveying a version of my own personal experience.
Hmm.
And I remember, I mean, it's funny, I spent half of my MFA program, I mean, I spent all of my MFA program just writing short stories, but I spent the
Hmm.
first half really trying to write stories like the ones that I read and loved. So I realized kind of halfway through that there was something false about them because I was trying to emulate like Carver, I was trying to emulate Cheever, I was trying to emulate, like Flannery O'Connor in these different ways. And they weren't speaking true. And it wasn't until my third term, I was working with an author named Stuart Nadler, who is also Jewish and has written about American Jewish themes,
Hmm.
when I started to kind of explore this. And it was really his guidance that helped me understand first that, it's important to write about things that matter to you. That's the only way you can kind of get to something truthful.
Yeah.
But also that it's, you don't have to be afraid about writing about your personal experience,
Hmm.
for fear of kind of being held up as this representative or sort of this example.
Yeah, you're not trying to represent a collective experience, you're trying to represent an
Exactly.
individual's experience. And it's really important to remember that. Now, you do tackle in your book the subject of Israel and Palestine, and I feel like you do this with real thought and care, but you don't shy away from the sort of divisive nature of the subject. How do you hope this will be received?
Yeah, I so the this is the part of the book that maybe I'm not most concerned about, but most interested in how it will be
Yeah,
received.
yeah,
Um,
I think that's fair.
what I hope is, I think there's a few things. One is I think being American and being Jewish means something in terms of identity and in terms of community and
Yeah.
also in terms of Israel. I think these things are all sort of baked in from a very early
Hmm.
age. And I think that if you feel conflicted about these things, it's easy to be made to feel less Jewish in some way, shape, or form. That there is some kind of inextricable bond between the two. And I think this is really what I wanted to explore through Aaron's character. How I hope it will be received. I hope if somebody else feels this way and they feel alone, that they read this book and realize that they aren't. I think for me, the most powerful aspect of literature is being able to read a book, being, experiencing something you think you're going through alone, and read a book and realize, no, this is something that has been felt before, or I am seeing. in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like you write the nuances and the complexities of this situation so well. And there's kind of a moment in the book where Aaron is walking across, I think it's like across a campus with someone, and she says like, "Oh, do you not think like this pro-Palestine rally is a bit anti-Semitic or I think however she words it?" And he's just like, "No, like what do you mean?" So I think you really show like how people come to think in that way and how he kind of navigates that is so interesting. But yeah, I really hope that you don't receive any kind of pushback about this. I don't feel like you could because you've not written anything wrong, but you never know with these things how they're going to be received because it is such a divisive subject, especially, across the last year or so. It is quite a difficult time, and I just really wanted to ask you about that.
I think something worth noting is that I wrote this in September of 2022, so a year before October 7th.
Yeah.
And this book was kind of finished and in editing stages at that point. But of course, tensions and injustices did not begin on
Hmm.
October 7th. This is something obviously that was on my mind while I was writing this, and it's just something that unfortunately has become quite prescient to the current moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about another really special relationship in the book, and that is between Roisin and Aaron's dad, Michael. And I loved the bond between the two of them because it's so unexpected, but it's so wonderful. And I'm saying I don't want to give any spoilers away. I don't feel like this is much of a spoiler, but I love,
Go for it.
huh?
I said go for it.
It's not a major spoiler, so that's the main thing. But I loved their walks together and the fact that he would pack a flask for the two of them and tuck them into his pockets. And I just love the bond they built together. Why did you want these characters to connect in the way that they do? And what do you think that they found in the other?
Yeah. Well, first off, I'm glad that that came through. It was one of my favorite parts of the book to write was this relationship between these two. For me, I think it actually wound up developing quite naturally as I was writing through
Hmm.
the editing process and through the writing process. It was kind of these scenes sort of tended towards a direction. Then once I saw that possibility, it felt quite natural and as if the steps preceding were really leading to it. For me, what I think they find in each other, I think you have this situation sort of towards the second half of the book where Aaron's father is feeling quite distant from his son. So he has his son physically with him, but not he doesn't have that emotional connection. He doesn't have
Hmm.
that parent-child relationship. And you have Roisin, who's really missing the warmth of her family and that type of parental love that obviously she's not feeling. And so I think they find each other in this moment where they need a version of what the other person represents,
Hmm.
uh, without any history, without any baggage, without anything behind it. So they can come forward sort of as a more honest version of themselves. Something I hope to convey is that how they are with each other kind of slightly different from how they interact with other characters. And mainly that is what I hope to convey by that is you really, I think, especially with family and especially with friends that you've known for kind of all your life, you play into a certain regressive sort of role with them. And it's this unique opportunity to meet somebody for the first time and not really know that history so you can see who they actually are today.
Mm, I love that. I also just wanted to mention because it's just popped into my head. I love the way that you write Irish humor because the moment that I mentioned earlier when she calls her family on Christmas Day and her mum is making cups of tea for the family and I think is it her brother is like I don't know if that she's trying to get her to speak to Roisin or what the conversation is, but he's basically like, am I going to get this cup of tea by New Year? Like, what's going on? And she's like, you can come in here and get it yourself if you want. Like, I just loved that. It was just so great to, because you don't spend time with her family like you do with
Right.
Aaron's family. It was so nice to have that moment with the phone call where you could kind of get a glimpse of the things that she's missing and the kind
Yeah.
of busy household that she's missing out on. So I just thought that was a really nice touch. I thought
Oh,
I'd
great.
mention that.
Yeah, I'm so glad that that came through. I think being an American, having moved to Ireland, I think it was very important for me that these aspects of the book, I mean, Roisin, her family, those kinds of qualities of speech and humor came through.
Mm,
And for that, I really have to thank my wife, who is Irish. who we would kind of read through chapters and I'd say, is this like I want you to be extra critical here because she's so nice, but it's like, can you be extra critical because Irish people are going to be reading this, and what I don't want them to think is, oh, here's this American who like, gets all this stuff wrong.
I love that. I want to talk about Roisin actually because I do think, and I wonder if maybe you asked your wife for feedback on this as well, but I feel like you write women so well.
Oh, thank
And
you.
I find sometimes with male writers, and this isn't a criticism of male writers, I don't want anybody to think that's what I'm coming on the podcast to do because it's not. But I sometimes feel like when I read a male writer writing a woman, obviously they don't have that experience. So I sometimes feel like I'm observing a character rather than being able to relate to that experience. Whereas there are moments in the book where I really related to Roisin and I felt like I could see aspects of myself in her, and I just thought you wrote her so well. And there is actually, I folded down a couple of pages, so I'm gonna have to find it. Oh no, I've gone straight to it. Amazing. So she's on the subway, and there's like a man in a suit that's kind of staring at her and making her a little bit uncomfortable and trying to like chat to her. And do you mind me reading a quote? Sorry.
Please,
Okay.
please.
So it says, there is a prevalent belief among men that by exchanging courtesies, they are indebted attention. Roisin wants to firmly correct this assumption, but even if she convinces this man, she'll never convince every man, and it is infinitely more difficult to fight the flow of moving water than to let it take her. And I just loved that moment so much because I was like, I have felt that so many times, and you just perfectly capture these different aspects of what it feels like to be a woman in the kind of like navigating the modern world and navigating, power dynamics with men. And we kind of get a glimpse of a past relationship that she's had that's kind of affected her. And we also see, how strange her manager at the coffee shop is. And I just thought that was so interesting. And she's just a great character. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk about her a little bit. I know that's not really a
Oh, thank
question,
you.
so I'm sorry.
No, please don't be sorry. That's so nice to hear. Yeah, this is obviously I think that there is, as you said, there's a precedent for male authors to frequently get this kind of stuff wrong a
Mm,
lot. And I think my take on this is it's laziness and it's lack of empathy. Like I think the bar is extremely low for these things. I
mm.
think I don't know that I've ever heard an interview with a female author where somebody says, God, like the way you write men is so believable, or like
Yeah,
because
yeah,
that tends to be the expectation is that a female author will get the men completely right.
yeah.
And of course they'll get the women completely right because, the assumption is that you would have to. I think I think to be a writer, my experience is when you write a character, it's you. It's like a different version. It's like an exaggerated version, but there's some core truth that you have experienced that you are trying to express
Mm,
here. And for me, it was so important to get Roisin right, first because she's such an instrumental part of the book,
hmm.
but also because, as I said before, I think if you read a book and are made to feel more alone, that's like the worst thing a book can do. So if you read a book and think like this woman does not exist, she is not like a person, nobody has had this experience.
Mm.
And I think that that's actively kind of a bad thing to put out into the world. It's something that I really wanted to avoid. So I'm glad that it came through. And
It definitely did. Let's talk about Aaron because I've rambled on about Roisin, but I did love her so much, understandably. So you explore with his character, you explore masculinity and mental health in this really powerful and kind of visceral way. And he really struggles to articulate his mental health and his struggles with that and the sort of symptoms that he experiences as a result of his depression. And I think grief also plays a huge role in his experiences and in the novel as well. And I did say I don't want to give any spoilers, so I am going to tread carefully. But I just want to ask what drew you to exploring these themes in your writing?
yeah, that's a great question. I think it's unfortunately the truth that a lot of this is sort of a state of the world where men don't often kind of share these things.
Hmm.
And I think it was kind of important for me. I mean, first of all, it made sense within the context of the story that Aaron is coming from this place of isolation and hurt that he keeps to himself and has kept to himself for so long,
Hmm.
that it would express itself in these ways. But once it started, it really made sense to kind of focus on it in this way. I think throughout the book, there's kind of this ongoing thing with the characters of sacrificial pain, like
Hmm.
self-sacrificial pain. There's I think every character, or I hope every character has put some type of buffer between them and what they actually need out of principle or out of, some kind of misplaced taking a stand or something.
Mm,
So Aaron creates this wall between him and his parents because he has this ideological difference between them. And as an excuse, he sort of blames them for his brother's death. But of course, like what he needs most is to be able to talk to people who are grieving in the same way that he is and
mm,
to be able to communicate. And you have Roshin, who has been living in the United States and continues to live in the United States, no matter how difficult and awful it gets in some ways, sort
mm,
of out of this principle of at least I've done something. Like I've moved away, and if I move away and then I come back a few years later, then that means that I've failed in some kind of fundamental way. And you have the same thing with the parents without giving too much away, but everybody is putting up walls
yeah,
and they're doing so out of the idea that it means something bigger. And if I hope the book says anything, it's that these walls wind up being meaningless. Creating that distance is a mistake.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's kind of where it came from and how it expressed in all of the characters.
It's a really beautiful exploration of mental health, and I think it will resonate with a lot of people. And there's something for everyone in there in terms of the way each character experiences their own struggles with either mental health or with grief or with something else. And it's not a spoiler to say this because it says it in the blurb, but Rushine finds out that she's pregnant in the book, and it is a really complicated experience for her. Why did you want to represent the experience in this way? Is it kind of an extension of being homesick and like another type of grief? Like, is that what that was?
I think for me, Roshin's experience of becoming pregnant was definitely rooted in the idea of there's kind of this rootedness that happens if you're going to start a family that
Hmm.
infinitely complicates being from two different countries
Yeah.
and infinitely complicates a relationship where two people have very different identities. And in this book, that's primarily focused on their very different religious identities and how can these two things come together.
Hmm.
And so much time is spent with Aaron's family and in the context, and they're quite observant and they're religious. And Roshin is very anti-religious and doesn't really see the point. And for her, I wanted there to be a dilemma of obviously loving Aaron, wanting to be with Aaron,
Hmm.
being pregnant, and the idea of a family means that you can no longer be two individual people. I mean, the kid has to have some type of deliberate choices around its raising, which are informed by identity. So for me, it made sense narratively as like a culmination of pressure, as like as the stakes get higher, the ability to leave, becomes more and more distant or more complicated.
Mm.
So for me, it was important from the context of narrative, and it's also, from it's something that I don't know that I've read a lot about in books
Hmm.
is how complicated it can be when somebody who is Jewish and identifies strongly with being Jewish decides to be with and start a family with somebody who isn't, and sort of,
Yes.
and it's not necessarily unique to being Jewish, but it's certainly something that, this is like a personal thing thinking about because I am. But I think when you have two people with very different identities, I think that's what I wanted to try to capture.
Yeah, and you did that so well. And I think going back to what you said before about the people kind of putting up walls and showing that at the end of the day, like these walls, like they don't help you in any way. And it's really difficult to kind of watch her go through her pregnancy and just kind of hide away in the bedroom and to just kind of sit aimlessly scrolling social media and kind of not knowing what to do with herself is really difficult to watch because you're like, no, please just speak to somebody. Like, please just. So I think that was why I really liked her relationship with his dad because it feels like they could kind of connect in a way that surpassed conversation. They didn't need to say their struggles out loud. They could just kind of walk together and be together, and they found a connection in that way instead. So I just thought that was really beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, if it wasn't clear enough, I really loved this book. So for our listeners, please go and grab yourselves a copy. It is out tomorrow, and I am going to pop a link in the show notes. Before I let you go, James, I do want to ask a couple of questions because I I'm just such a huge fan of your writing style, and I'm really upset that I don't have a back catalogue of yours that I can go and seek out. I want to know what writers have influenced you.
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, something for me while I'm working on a writing project, I have some idea of stylistically or mechanically kind of what I'm trying to emulate or what I'm trying to go for in support of the narrative. So for me, like I really tend to read books that will help while I'm writing. I tend to read books that will help that writing. So for this, it probably will come as no surprise that I was reading a lot of Sally Rooney and trying to kind of understand the mechanics of writing a really compelling and propulsive narrative about a relationship that's more nuanced than maybe they're typically represented. For me, the other book that really influenced Placeholders was a book called The Netanyahus by Joshua Cohen, and it's a very interesting book that's sort of a fictionalized account of when the Netanyahu family stayed with Harold Bloom, who's a professor in the States, and it's a very almost haunting read because you get portrayals of the Netanyahus as children, who we now know, of course, being so impactful to today. But part of why I like this book and why it influenced Placeholder so much is it has a lot to say on the Jewish American experience and
Yeah.
sort of Jewish American identity. And beyond that, it's also like a fairly fun book. Like, I mean, there's moments of sort of domestic turbulence that are rendered quite well. But in terms of just at a higher level, authors that influence me, I read a lot of Ben Lerner. I read a lot of Raymond Carver for kind of economy of prose. My favorite author is, I think, Nicole Krauss, who wrote a book, two books that I find very influential. One of them is called The Book of Love, and the other one is called Great House. And I think the way that she builds her narratives in split ways, and I mean, she's just like truly incredible.
I haven't read her work, so I need to
She's
get hold of those ASAP.
Yeah, she is very incredible. Yeah, she's written a few novels. Those two are my favorite by far. Great House, I think, is really like a masterpiece.
I'm gonna get hold of that immediately.
Yeah, of course.
So
There's
gone.
one other book that I want to mention, or although
Yes,
maybe
is
this
this
is
your
later, it might be a surprise.
recommendation?
Recommendations?
No,
I
go
want to
for it.
steer
Let's hear
genre
your
to my last.
recommendation. I love this. Let's go.
So I'm gonna keep it kind of I'm gonna constrain myself. There's a book that I'm gonna try to. There's a book that came out last year by Anne Enright called The Wren, which
Yes,
I
so
am
good.
obsessed with. I thought it was unbelievable. Like the way that she handles the split voices and how different those characters are. It's about a mother and daughter and switches between them, and it's somewhat fragmentary, and it's just unbelievably beautiful writing throughout.
She's incredible.
She's truly like, yeah, she's I've had the opportunity to meet her a couple of times, and she's just such an incredible writer.
We had her on the
Um,
podcast, and I was like a nervous wreck beforehand. I was like,
can't even imagine.
I'm talking to a literary giant. Like, what do you
Yeah,
mean?
absolutely. I know.
Insane. Is there another recommendation?
Yeah,
Oh,
so another one, another Irish author, also came out last year. This is Falling Animals by Sheila Armstrong.
I've not
Uh,
read this.
this is fantastic. I think it's Bloomsbury. Yep. Yeah, I see it. Yeah, because I physically have it here. It's got a beautiful cover
Oh,
as well.
gorgeous.
It's a novel about a small town, a small coastal town in Ireland, and it immediately follows the events after a body is discovered washed up on shore. And
Ooh,
what I find so cool about this book is that it's a novel in stories, and oftentimes with novels and stories, really, it's just sort of like a marketing term for a collection of short stories that are somewhat related. But this is very much so one continuous kind of thematic question pulled through many different people's experiences. And I just found the writing so incredible, and it's such a compelling story.
have you read the Coast Road by Alan Morin?
No, I haven't.
I feel like you'll
This is
really
on my
love that.
list.
It's amazing, and I also felt like Alan is an incredible writer of women as well. He really writes these complex, really fleshed out female characters, and you just get totally. It's also set in a coastal town in Ireland, and you just kind of get it's a very like gossipy town. They are very judgmental, and you really get into the kind of nitty-gritty dramas of everyday
Amazing.
life there. It's fantastic. So yeah, go grab
That's
that.
definitely made
I'll be adding
that's made
yours
my
to my
list.
list.
Yeah,
But
I hate to do this. I have one last one
oh
just
my
to take
gosh,
up more
yes, I
time.
love this.
I promise this is the
No, I
last
love
one.
this.
But this is a book that I came across kind of by chance. It's a collection of stories by a Polish writer named Mikołaj Greenberg, and it's called "I'd Like to Say Sorry, but There's No One to Say Sorry to."
I
Uh,
love that title.
and it's fascinating. He is a Polish psychologist and he's also a photographer. And basically, what he did is he took kind of stories from sessions with his patients and sort of mixed them up and tells in this very fragmentary way the kind of state of Polish Jews in Poland today. So usually there's stories about Polish people who find out only when a grandparent dies or by going through records or by going to a graveyard or things like this, that actually their grandparent is Jewish and hid this fact for the family's safety and pretended not to be Jewish and sort of buried it. And it's a fascinating read. It's short. All of the stories are like 1 or 2 pages. And I mean, for me, it's like one of the best books that I've ever read.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I'm really happy that you've brought so many recommendations, but I'm also a little bit cross because I'm like, I'm just gonna add about 6 or 7 more books to my ever-growing TBR pile. So,
Of course.
but I'm
Yeah.
sure I'll thank you later once I've read them. But thank you so much. I've loved chatting about your book. I've loved getting these book recommendations from you. And for our listeners, please go and buy yourselves a copy of Placeholders. As I said, I'll be popping a link in the show notes. It is out tomorrow. Go show it some love. It's much deserved. And then please come and chat to me about it because I want to have a conversation with somebody full of spoilers. And there's so much more I could have spoken about. But yeah, we love to keep it spoiler free. And I didn't want to spoil this experience for anyone because it's amazing. Thank you so much for writing it, James. And
Thank you
thanks
so
so much
much.
for coming on the podcast.
Of course, thank you so much for having me on. This has been such a wonderful experience.
Thank you. And where can our listeners find you on social media?
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter at JSR Writes. Probably the best place.
Wonderful. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at a pair of bookends pod on Instagram and at a pair of bookends on Twitter and TikTok. That is all we've got time for. But thank you so much once again, James. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.